Hello, my wonderful subscribers, and today we're going to be talking about something that needs a lot of clarification within the fantasy community. But before I get into that, yesterday I did a phenomenal interview with Hello Future Me, aka Tim, one of my favorite YouTubers on the platform, and we had a wonderful time talking Tolkien, fantasy in general, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and if you want to check it out, link in the description down below, or hit the card thingy I'm going to put right here. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and talk about subgenres in fantasy. Subgenres in fantasy have exploded in popularity recently, not only in what's being read and written, but how it's being talked about. It almost seems like you can't have a conversation about your favorite fantasy series without someone saying, yeah, but it's not high fantasy though, so it's not even really worth it though. And that's a lot of what I'm trying to dissuade here in this video. Subgenre of fantasy doesn't mean a whole lot, and there is quite literally thousands of subgenres, and I'm going to explain as many of them as possible here today. But if you're going to take away anything from this video, just realize that most fantasy books fall into dozens of subgenres of fantasy itself, and there are very few subgenres that are in any way, shape, or form superior to another in any way, unless you're specifically looking for something like fantasy inspired by real history. That's a thing. But no, just saying something's high fantasy, therefore it's better, doesn't hold a whole lot of merit. And we're going to go ahead and get into this now as we explore about 20 plus subgenres of fantasy, what they mean, and a recommendation from me or from critics online, because I haven't read something in that subgenre yet, of which fantasy books you should check out if you're interested in that fantasy subgenre. So let's go ahead and start off with alternative history fantasy. This subgenre is pretty self-explanatory. You take an event from history or a period of time and you twist the event and add your own fantastical elements, and now you have alternative history fantasy. Moving on. I actually haven't read much from this subgenre, so I actually just pulled online. A very popular example is apparently Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Next subgenre, we have one that's a bit more popular. Arthurian fantasy. This is fantasy that has died out in popularity a lot recently. There has not been a major Arthurian tale written in a long time that's had massive critical and commercial success, but this is just basically fantasy inspired by the Arthurian legend specifically. And yes, Arthurian legends do often fall into alternative history fantasy as well. See how we're kind of getting into already these blurred lines? But if you are interested in Arthurian fantasy, I personally am actually reading The Once and Future King right now and love it. And just to show how specific these now classifications of fantasy can be, and yes, you can find declarations of this is the subgenre and these books fall into it and these books don't, there is officially now assassin fantasy, which is specifically fantasy about assassins. And if you'd like the most popular example of assassin fantasy, I can think of the Night Angel trilogy by Brent Weeks. It was huge in popularity. I thought it was okay, but many people will swear by this series, and I'm not going to go against those people, so I will go ahead and say, yes, check out Night Angel if you want to check out some good assassin fantasy. Now transitioning into more of the controversial fantasy subgenres, we have Christian fantasy. No, this is not the Bible. Going ahead and hedging off that annoying, angsty atheist comment of well, if you want to talk about Christian fantasy, just put the Bible in there. You're not funny. Everyone in the world's made that joke. Ha ha ha. I'm not religious, and I find that annoying. But this is fantasy that is specifically inspired by Christian themes, and there's no better known example of this than the Chronicles of Narnia, one of the most well-known fantasy series ever written by C.S. Lewis. You know of these books and you know of their Christian themes if you even have the loosest understanding of fantasy as a whole. Next up, we have comic/absurdist fantasy, something I deeply love for fantasy and sci-fi. Basically, it's fantasy where the point is lulz. Let's get some lulz, let's get some laughs, let's have some weird, strange things happen, break conventions, and just kind of break the whole genre a lot of the times. It's truly great. Some of the most creative minds in the history of fantasy have had a huge amount of fun crafting some of the most whimsical, wild, and hilarious stories that have ever been told. If you'd like to check out some absurdist comedic fantasy, you cannot go wrong with Discworld. I read and reviewed the first book and did not particularly love it, but I have since read the second and third and enjoyed them much more so. they're wonderful. So, especially the depiction of death. Who in their right mind would have ever thought to depict death like that? But it's like one of the greatest characters I've ever come across. So, yes, Discworld is probably the best absurdist / comedic fantasy ever written. Now, moving away from times and tones, we have coming-of-age fantasy. This is a bit more broad and general, one that is widely really loved by a certain age group because they can highly relate to it. This is the story of your protagonist kind of exploring this wider, dangerous world as they're also coming of age, growing up a little bit, maybe having their first romantic experiences. Let's be honest, this subgenre, they're always having their first romantic experiences. Sometimes they're having their first kiss, sometimes they're having their first lay. And speaking of first lay, the recommendation I will give for this subgenre is without question The Kingkiller Chronicles. It's a coming-of-age tale of the protagonist, Kvothe, one I don't particularly love, but is wildly popular, and something that everyone from teenagers to adults will praise as being one of their most, if not their most, favorite fantasy series. So The Kingkiller Chronicles will be your recommendation for the subgenre of fantasy of coming of age. Next up, we have court intrigue fantasy. This is the one where the political, thrilling atmosphere and aspects of the story are central. Basically, who's going to betray who? The kings, the lords, the nobility, the houses playing their games. It's truly, if you like the House of Cards vibe, this is the way to go. You know, having people plot and plan, really having a battle of wits between houses of some kind of power level is the core of the court intrigue fantasy subgenre, and I can't think of a recommendation better known or more highly praised right now than A Song of Ice and Fire. There are many others that could fall in here as well. First Law also belongs in this spot, although I'm going to put that in another recommendation later on, but A Song of Ice and Fire is a prime example of how manipulation and backstabbing drives the plot and is really at the heart of the story here. I don't think anyone would really negate that. You have these houses moving nations to make plays against each other. Now, after court intrigue fantasy, we have dark fantasy. This is not grimdark fantasy. I want to make that very clear. Grimdark fantasy does fall into another subgenre. Dark fantasy is fantasy that has really horrifying themes at its core, really exploring the darker parts of the human mind. Also different from horror fantasy, which again we will get into later. For dark fantasy, there's no better recommendations I can give than H.P. Lovecraft's work or maybe Dark Tower by Stephen King. These are the two best examples of dark fantasy I can think of, and I probably have a slightly stronger recommendation for Dark Tower. And just to prove that yes, these subgenres really can come down to like one instance of one thing being involved with the plot, there's also a subgenre called dragon fantasy, which means there's dragons that are important. I'd recommend The Hobbit if you're interested in that. And now we transition into one of the most hotly debated and contested subgenres of fantasy. What exactly is it, and how do you define it? I was actually on a panel at JordanCon where we discussed this at great length. What is epic / high fantasy? And yes, they are the same thing. The things that try to describe them as differently just split hairs in the most finite way and try to say they're different. No, people who know what they're talking about say yes, epic and high are the same thing. But what is epic / high fantasy? A lot of people say you need a certain number of books, certain word count, certain aspects to the story. No. In the most widely accepted definition of high / epic fantasy, having your fantasy story take place in its own original created and crafted world is the true definition that is actually accepted right now. It does not take place on Earth. It is not here. There's no Boston, New York, Rome, what have you. It is in its own original continent, world, etc., and the author has taken the time to create that. This gets a little blurred, and there's a bit of debate. Well, some people will say, well, Wheel of Time is technically Earth in the way future, so it's not epic / high fantasy. And there are many fantasy stories that have the same kind of premise where it is Earth in a different time after catastrophic events. That is there as well, but because the cultures are wholly original, it's not actually Earth's future or past, or it's not really pulling on specific historic events, and it's so far removed, I believe it still absolutely does qualify as high / epic fantasy because there's so much work put into crafting the original actual setting. So I think the setting of the current book is what's key to this actual definition. But I'm ready for angry comments letting me know that no, high fantasy is this fantasy series with 10 plus books. That's the line. That's high fantasy and epic fantasy to those people for some reason who really hang their hat on that. Now, if you want my recommendation for high/epic fantasy, I'm going to go ahead and throw you towards the highest and most epicest of fantasies and what also I'm currently reading right now, and that would be Malazan, Book of the Fallen. If we are talking about epic fantasy and just in terms of how big and huge the author made their world, there is no question that Malazan, Book of the Fallen is the biggest and hugest, that's not proper English, but I'm going with it, epic fantasy series ever written. It's unquestionable at this point, not in word count, but in concept and execution. My God, Stephen Erickson, you're a madman and I love you for it. And now to transition into a little bit more of a fun topic, because some people are going to be still angry about the last one, we're going to talk about erotic fantasy. This is a real subgenre. It exists. It's prevalent. It has millions of readers. And it's fantasy that focuses on there's a lot of sex at the center of it. A lot of time and effort put in for that. I don't have a recommendation for this one, really. Go ahead and leave your recommendation for erotic fantasy in the comments down below. Now transitioning into fables/fairy tale fantasy. Fairy tale/fable fantasy often relies on existing lore to develop its own story off of it. So you'll find things and tropes that exist in the common accepted lore of whatever culture it is pulling from. Whether it's the fairies, literally, or more just having like Red Riding Hood in the story. That is where a fable type fantasy comes from. Big bad wolf type things. It's pretty self-explanatory. For this, I'd recommend Midsummer's Night Dream by William Shakespeare. We're going outside the box because I feel like it, and I also really love that play. And next up, we have Gas Lamp Fantasy, which is a weird name, but basically it's fantasy that takes place in a Victorian era setting. And there are people who are die-hard to this setting for their fantasy. They're not interested in medieval or classical or modern. No, they like Victorian era fantasy. It's what gets their rocks off. I get it, I guess. I kind of like, I'm more open to more things, but these people really like the bodices and the muskets. For the recommendation, I'll go ahead and say Dracula. It's not the typical Victorian era fantasy, but I also just wanted to recommend Dracula again, because Bram Stoker's Dracula is actually a phenomenal book, and it technically qualifies. And a lot of the books I'm going to recommend do technically qualify for the subgenre I'm putting them in, and you cannot make me not do it. Now, if epic and high fantasy was the kind of controversial thing to talk about here on this list, the absolute most controversial and one that will result in someone leaving an angry comment saying I don't understand grimdark, even though I literally double-checked the actual definitions online before I made this video, we have grimdark fantasy. Now, at its core, grimdark fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy that focuses more on the violent nature of mankind or immoral actions being portrayed more accurately. The histories are written by the victors, etc., etc. This type of mentality, where your protagonist might not necessarily be a good person, or they'll flat out be an awful human being. Maybe someone who's justified in their actions, but their actions are still that of a monster's. It's not always quite that extreme. Maybe just the good guys don't win or take up the majority of the page time. They certainly can still exist in grimdark stories, but the main distinction for grimdark here is that the immorality is not necessarily punished and can sometimes, if not often, be rewarded and promoted. My recommendation for grimdark fantasy still is, and probably will be for the foreseeable future, First Law by Joe Abercrombie. I have never seen immoral characters portrayed so well and you root for them so much because the author understands dialogue and humanity like no other. Joe Abercrombie is a master of his craft, and First Law is so good at dragging you into some twisted minds. Next up, we have gunpowder/flintlock fantasy, and basically this means shoot bangs exist, but only old shoot bangs, you know, the kind that take like a minute to load. Musket era is what I mean here. I actually really like muskets in my fantasy for some reason. And I have two strong recommendations for flintlock fantasy here. We have Lightbringer, where the guns aren't necessarily at the forefront, and I know many people actually are kind of surprised when they think about it and realize, yeah, Lightbringer is a gunpowder fantasy. And then we have one where it's much more at the center focus and everyone realizes it's flintlock fantasy, and that would be the Powder Mage trilogy. Both awesome series. I have not made my way completely through the Powder Mage trilogy yet, and Lightbringer has a book about to come out. So I can't recommend them all the way to their end, but the start of the Powder Mage trilogy is phenomenal, and the Lightbringer series up to this point is fantastic. Let's burn a couple of these out pretty quick because they're kind of shallow and don't have a whole lot to them. Heroic fantasy. You have your main protagonist against the immoral baddie, and they clash, and that is heroic fantasy. There's not a whole lot of disjointed focus. For this one, I'm going to recommend The Inheritance Cycle. You got your evil king, you got your protagonist, they fight, Boom. Inheritance cycle, heroic fantasy. Low fantasy, the opposite of high/epic fantasy. It takes place within our own world. It's happening here and now. There's just like a hidden fantasy element that we normal people don't know about, but it definitely exists in our own world. The recommendation I will go here for this one is obviously Harry Potter. It's the most well-known low fantasy of all time. And no, low fantasy for no reason is inherently worse than high fantasy. Get off your high fantasy horse. Magic realism fantasy is when your magic has severe limits or consequences for being used. Basically, Mistborn or almost any magic system Brandon Sanderson comes up with. Medieval fantasy. Don't need to tell you the definition of this one, and just most fantasy books. Forgotten Realms, sure, go with that one. Military fantasy. The protagonist is in the military and you're exploring the life of a soldier of the fantasy story. Paranormal fantasy. The focus of the fantasy elements are usually pulled from paranormal things. Basically, anything Stephen King is going to be paranormal fantasy/horror fantasy. Quest fantasy. One mission drives the plot and all protagonists are focused on that mission. The most prime example and well-known of all time is the most well-known fantasy story of all time, The Lord of the Rings. The quest is, burn the ring, throw it in the Mountain Doom. And that drives all plot for The Lord of the Rings, and it's certainly a great formula to have a laser-focused fantasy story. Portal fantasy. You need to go through some kind of dimensional skipping to get to the fantastical world. The most well-known example of this is without question Alice in Wonderland. Romantic fantasy is the focus of the story. Science fantasy. Science fiction bleeds into your fantasy and you have sci-fantasy. The most well-known example of this, and one that I don't particularly love, but I'd be remiss if I didn't recommend it as the recommendation for this, would be Dune. Series fantasy. Any fantasy series. My recommendation is The Wheel of Time. Steampunk fantasy. Basically Victorian era with fake technologies, things that kind of still stick within the boundaries of what is available in steam power, but technologies that go far above and beyond what we've ever actually realized with steam power. The example I will pull from here is Alloy of Law, or aka the second era of Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. I haven't read a better example than that. Superhero fantasy. Basically, superheroes at the center of it. Anything by Marvel and DC that's superhero. That's your recommendation. Go with that one. And now getting into one I do feel a need to elaborate on a bit more. Swashbuckling fantasy. This one is brought up quite a bit, and people claim that it is basically involving boats in some way. That's not true. Swashbuckling fantasy is more defined by having a charming or funny protagonist and having more of a lighthearted approach to things that maybe are dark, maybe aren't. There's not really a prevention of tone from even going grimdark to the story, but swashbuckling fantasy is more about having a protagonist who is a swashbuckler. It does not have to involve boats. That's actually wrong. After double checking this and triple checking this, no. Boats are not required for swashbuckling fantasy, and the recommendation I'm going to go for this one here is Gentlemen Bastards. You want to pick up the first book, Lies of Locke Lamora? It's fantastic. Urban fantasy, modern fantasy. I don't know why it's not just called modern fantasy, but urban fantasy is typically modern fantasy. 99% of the time takes place within a city, although that's actually not entirely true. There are modern fantasy stories that take place in the countryside, but are still referred to as urban fantasy. So in that case, it is just modern fantasy. And the example I will give here is Dresden Files, my personal favorite urban fantasy ever, and if you love a charming, funny protagonist who drives a story like no other, you cannot really go wrong with Dresden Files. I skipped a lot of recommendations, I'm realizing, but it's just not worth it, man. Vampire fantasy. Vampires are the main thing, or in it. But the recommendation for this one I'm going to go for here is 40 Days of Night, a fantastic horror graphic novel that focuses around vampires and is just brutal and awesome. And ending here, we have YA fantasy, which is fantasy typically aimed at a younger audience, keeps its writing styles a bit more simplistic, and its theming more surface level. Though it's not inherently worse for that, but it is the qualification for being young adult fantasy. And the recommendation I will go for YA fantasy is The Golden Compass. Thank you guys so much. There are so many fantasy subgenres. I just went through a lot of them, and I barely scratched the surface of what truly exists. And the point of this video is, one, to better educate you on what exactly the actual definitions of these subgenres are, but to also prove the point that genre in general does not matter that much. Genre is a label that publishers and marketers put on our books so that they'll sell better and people have a slightly better understanding of what they're going in for. But I hate this idea that authors are somehow restricted and restrained by genre as a whole, somehow afraid to throw an idea in their story because they think it'll break the genre label they have. Don't let that exist. Don't be afraid to experiment with what you read and what you write. Genre is a label. That's it, and it should not craft your art. period, or what art you enjoy, period. Really, almost every fantasy story encapsulates 9, 10, hell, 100 subgenres that could apply to it. So this idea that my subgenre is better than yours, to me, is absolutely silly. Read what you want to read, and if something does appeal to you, like it being within the Victorian era, go for it. Read about those Victorian era fantasy elements and love them to death. But I personally don't really like being constricted by that. I'm going to find authors I like and follow the crap out of them. That's my strategy in general. Anyway, guys, I hope you've enjoyed learning a bit more about fantasy subgenres, what they are and what they mean, and my face yelling at you for like 20 minutes for this video. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace! And, of course, I'd like to record a special shout-out to my latest high-tier Patreon, who's in the contest for most badass name, Conrad Malfi Klingest. I hope I said that right. Have a good one, y'all. I'm done talking now.